Good morning and welcome to the 26th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. We have apologies for Willie Coffey MSP and Fulton McGregor MSP will be joining us online. And if I can ask everyone to have their devices on silent. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take items 3, 4, 5 and 6 in private. Are members agreed? Agreed, thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence from Mary McCallan MSP, the Cabinet Secretary for Housing, on the progress of the Scottish Government's cladding remediation programme and her portfolio priorities. And I want to welcome you warmly to your role. It's good to have you in our committee room and I look forward to the conversation this morning. And Ms McCallan is joined by Scottish Government officials, Matthew Elsby, who's the Deputy Director of Better Homes, Stephen Lee Ross, who's the Director of Cladding Remediation, and Jess Niven, who's the Interim Deputy Director in Heat and Buildings Policy and Regulation. So welcome to the meeting, and are we just going straight to questions? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to just go straight to questions, and I'm going to start, and then we've got members have a number of questions and interest. So we're going to focus the first initial set of questions around the cladding remediation programme. And initially, I'd be interested to understand, this is around the pilot phase of the cladding remediation programme, which was launched in 2021. I'd be interested to understand whether that has ended. What are the results from the pilot and what lessons have been learned that will inform future action?
Sure, thank you, Convener. Having not made an opening statement, I'll try and integrate some of those points into our remarks as we're going through. And I will come to the pilot phase and then I'll probably come to my colleague Stephen, who, as you've said, is the Director in charge of cladding. So I think, first of all, in respect of the pilot phase, and maybe taking the last bit of your question first on lessons learned, I think the two of the most important things for the government to overcome in respect to the progression of cladding has been, firstly, not requiring to bring together a single bespoke assessment that would be sufficient for consideration of dangerous cladding and what remediation works had to be done. So the pilot programme was very important in bringing together what is now the statutory single building assessment. I think the other issue that we had to overcome that the pilot assisted us with was the tenure situation in Scotland being a little different to elsewhere in the UK, and us requiring to ultimately take primary legislative powers to step in a multi-owner building where action wasn't being taken. So the pilot allowed us to do that. I would say the pilot has now ended, although you could also describe it as simply having become part of the wider single open call, which is now progressing. I might leave it there, Convener, and let you come back in on any other points that you wanted to say. But those two lessons learned are the most important thing, and the pilot has now been integrated into the larger single open call. And great. We can maybe say more about some of the buildings that were part of the pilot, if you wish. Yeah,
well, certainly. So actually, just that leads into the next point I wanted to bring in, which is what prompted the government to launch this open call at this stage in the process. So I guess that's part of that expansion you're talking about. And what information it holds on the buildings with potentially flammable cladding, especially and we'd be particularly interested in the data provided by the 2021 inventory on high-rise buildings and subsequent evidence that was gathered.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose I've probably inadvertently answered your second question there in my opening remarks. I might allow Stephen maybe to say if there's anything else he would want to comment on in respect of what we've learned from the pilot, and then we'll be happy to give an update. I can come back, Convener, on the high-rise inventory and some of the other questions.
Yes, thank you. So as the Cabinet Secretary has highlighted, those were the two most significant lessons learned from the pilot. I think it's also important to reference significant other learning came from the pilot in terms of addressing how we might then build up this programme to deliver at the scale and pace that the Cabinet Secretary has set out in her recent plan of action. And learning from the pilot led to the adoption of the distributed delivery model that we now have for cladding remediation. As the Cabinet Secretary has already pointed out, we have integrated the outcome of the pilot into the broader single open call. Prior to doing that, we undertook an independent assessment of all of the buildings in the pilot. That pilot phase from 2021 onwards initially began with 30 buildings. That was expanded over subsequent rounds to 107 buildings. All of those buildings were then independently assessed, alongside us taking forward development of the single buildings assessment methodology that we now have as part of the statutory framework. Following the outcome of that assessment process, that independent assessment process, we were left with 56 buildings. 10 of those buildings had been taken on by a developer as part of their responsibilities under the Accord. We had 2 that do not require any further assessment. We had 13 buildings that were taken forward for a government-commissioned assessment in order for us to test the outcomes of the promulgated SBA process, and we had a variety of information about those buildings from various sources. And then finally, there are 32 other buildings that are identified as requiring an SBA. They've been integrated into the wider single open call process, and those buildings, we're in contact. We made contact with the owners and pre-populated expressions of interest for them, so that those buildings can be taken forward without hesitation.
Okay, thanks.
And I just add that to what Stephen said there, Convener, which is just an overall general point, which is our approach to this programme is both top-down and bottom-up. So the single open call, which has gone live following the passage of the Act and it coming into force at the start of this year, creates a programme into which any building owner can now bid for a statutory bespoke single building assessment of their property, and we have made funding for SPA single building assessments available. We doubled that over the summer. We made more money available for immediate mitigation measures where these are required. So it's broad, it's open, it says come forward, have your building assessed to this bespoke standard. But alongside that, we're also doing a massive sweep-up exercise, which is about not only having the come forward and take advantage of this, but also we are going to proactively ask you what the status of your building is, what work may already have been done, whether it's planned for demolition, whether it's been demolished. And in that regard, we're working with the high-rise inventory, and in particular starting with those buildings within the HRI which have HPL or ACM cladding and are above 18 metres. And that's just about prioritising risk.
Okay, I think that's a very useful opening to get a sense of where you're at. I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart with a number of questions.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and members. You've touched on the single building assessment and you've indicated that you want to see progress in that. But, you know, really from the end of June, I think we've had 15 single assessments have been started and only 3 have been completed. So how disappointed are you at that with that progress? Because that is not good progress to date, I would suggest. And are there any barriers to individuals and organisations not having that taking place? Is it because we don't have enough qualified surveyors, or other issues when it comes to the professional indemnity insurances, or are there still some issues with the Scottish Government? It would be good to get a flavour of that, Cabinet Secretary.
Of course. And look, I understand that looking at those figures alone, you could quite readily come to the conclusion that you've reached there. Just a very brief update for the committee, and I would have mentioned this in opening, I'll mention it now. We have an updated position in respect of completed SBAs. As of the 30th of September 2025, 16 have been completed. So that's an increase from what Mr Stewart quite understandably was mentioning there. SBAs take about 3 to 4 months. They will differ depending on the complexity of the buildings and what's found. Some SPAs will be for more than one building. So we could be talking about one assessment, but it could be for a variety of buildings. I think the other contextual point I would want to say is that the SPAs have arisen from the Act. The Act came into force at the start of this year. So naturally, we are now at a position where we will start to see those numbers build. But that does not reflect the work that would already have been done by building owners across Scotland to do assessments short of the SBA, any works that may have flowed from that, and as I say, demolition or planned demolition, and that's what our information gathering exercise is speaking to. It might also just be worth letting the committee know that we now have 1,062 expressions of interest into the single open call for a single building assessment, and as of 30th September, 478 expressions of interest have received their grant support, so you will expect to see a very significant ramping up in the number of SBAs completed in the coming months. However, look, this is a complex process, so I think the questions about capacity are understandable. This is something that we have been keen to discuss with the stakeholders that we work with, and I understand the question had been put to the Institute of Fire Engineers. Stephen, I wonder if you could let the committee know what they said about capacity just to undertake the work.
Yes, so we do continue to engage with the Institute for Fire Engineers and other providers through our cladding stakeholder group. We last met with them in September, and the Institute for Fire Engineers did indicate that there is, to their understanding and knowledge, capacity within Scotland to undertake more SBAs. And obviously, following the provision of grants, we're also seeing local authorities and others take forward their own procurement processes for numbers of SBAs in batches per our award offer. We're, of course, not complacent. We have held sessions with industry to familiarise them with the SBA process and outputs, and to support capacity, obviously, albeit people must comply with the competency requirements set out in the SBA framework. The SBA can be undertaken by any suitably qualified person from across the UK or indeed abroad, providing that they are suitably competent and qualified in the field of fire engineering. We have undertaken lessons learned in relation to SBAs that were undertaken that we've commissioned, where we've identified issues. The complexities have been around things like where buildings have required rope access to access certain floors and buildings, and or where road closures have been required. We do proactively put this out in advice alongside our grant support for people commissioning SBA assessments, and we are working with local authorities just to advise of the need and urgency to turn around permit applications quickly, and we continue to engage with local authorities in that respect.
It's also vitally important that developers sign up to the cladding remuneration contract that you've set. But once again, the length of time that's taken seems to be problematic. So it would be good to get a flavour of what you feel are some of the issues that are arising from them not doing that as quickly as we would have hoped. And the numbers that are still wanting to do that must cause some concern, Cabinet Secretary, as to how that's progressing.
So I am certainly concerned to make sure that developers who were responsible for the construction of building with potentially dangerous cladding are contracted to deal with that. I think that we were talking here about a significant programme of substantial costs, the public, much of which the public purse will meet. But I do need that. And the time, we had the Accord in 2023, which developers signed, and the developer remediation contract, which we are now negotiating for signature, is on the same largely similar terms. So we have had agreement for a number of years that this was the direction of travel, and now it's about turning that accord into the contract and having it signed. But I am of a similar mind to you, because during the summer update that we did on cladding, I was keen to make sure that there was a deadline set for the signature of the contract. I've set 31 October. And that's not really a reflection of any concern on my part that developers won't sign it. We're in very good terms. We are exchanging drafts just now. Ultimately, it's just about bookending it and saying there will be a point after which this will be signed and we will move on. And it will line up, I think, quite well with the rest of the single open call taking off.
And and if they don't sign by the 31st of October, I mean, are there any penalties? Are there any processes that require to be looked at? Or is that just a date in the diary?
Like other negotiations, I will and my officials will be doing everything we can to make sure that it's signed by 31st October. As you can imagine, we're dealing with a number of different developers, all of whom have their own legal teams. But one of the ways we've tried to overcome that is firstly just by having regular communication, and I can stress it has been positive. There's nothing right now that would indicate to me that we're going to have trouble. But equally, we work with Homes for Scotland as the representative body, and they agreed the terms in principle, subject to exchange of legal views some time ago. So I wouldn't want to say that I'll be happy if it's not signed by 31st of October. I won't be, and it needs to be done. But there's nothing just now that indicates to me that that's going to be a problem. And ultimately, it's about we're all moving in the same direction, and it's just about a bookend, which I think is much needed.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. And Megan Gallagher.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. If I may pick up, just before I move on to my questions regarding the single building assessments, I would like to get a flavour of how many buildings could be contained within one single building assessment. So I think it's important for transparency and making sure that we've got the full picture in front of us.
Yes. I wonder, Stephen, whether of those already underway, you might have a flavour of how many of them have had multiple buildings within them.
Yes, we obviously commissioned the government commissioned SBAs that have been delivered. We have at the outside one SBA that contains 6 individual blocks of 6 individual buildings, but they're not individual buildings because they're joined by an underground car park. So essentially an SBA can contain any number of buildings, of stairwells, where there is an underground or overground connection to the building, and therefore we need to assess the building holistically. What I can say is that some of the SBAs that we've already undertaken, as I say, that one example there includes 6 blocks of a building. Also where we've undertaken building assessments, we've got typically 2, 3, 4 connected blocks of buildings, and anywhere in the region to 250, 300 individual dwellings in some of the largest complex SBA blocks that we've got.
That's helpful. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to explore what qualifies as a high-risk building over 18 metres tall that should be remediated or demolished by 2019. I understand we've got the residential element, and I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will be able to expand on that. But I'm certainly interested in the other buildings that have cladding attached to them. So I'm talking about hotels, hospitals, boarding schools, hostels, these types of buildings. And I've tried to, in the past, gather an explanation or an answer from government as to whether they will be included within this remediation work. So can the Cabinet Secretary give us that confirmation this morning?
Yeah, so between us we will, Ms Gallagher. I think firstly in respect of, so you were referring to our ultimate overall goal, which we published in the summer as being, and I'm just going to read it out just because I think we maybe got the date. I think you said 2019, which was just inadvertent, but by 2029, every high-rise residential building over 18 metres in Scotland will have been resolved, whether made safe, decommissioned or replaced, and every building between 11 and 18 metres will be on a defined pathway to resolution. So that was the commitment. And I think in terms of what qualifies as high risk, so ultimately we won't be able to say whether a building is high risk until it's had that SBA. And that's the beauty or the benefit of having this new bespoke statutory assessment. So ultimately that will be the decider of risk. But there are factors, so the height of the building, 18 metres plus being the riskiest and moving down. And then there's the type of cladding. I think I've already mentioned the ACM, the HPL cladding, which is known to have the greatest potential for risk. So again, that's another risk factor that we would take on, and that's why in our plan you will see that we have spoken of about 512 high-rise buildings with some cladding, and there are 144, according to the high-rise inventory and some other sources, which are both high-rise and have ACM or HPL cladding. And ultimately, they are the ones that I have my sights on most of all. So that maybe speaks to the characterisation of risk and what we're looking at there. Ultimately, the SBA will determine that. And I wonder, Stephen, whether you might be able to say more about the different types of buildings?
Yes, so this, so just for clarity, that our programme is concerned with residential buildings and with the remediation of residential buildings only. That's partly to do with the fact that the highest risk from dangerous cladding is posed in residential buildings that are not otherwise staffed and that therefore don't typically have round-the-clock service provision in terms of building monitoring. So the risk is appreciably different in other categories of building. There have been programmes under respective portfolios. There have been remediation works taken forward in relation to hospitals, particularly in the Queen Elizabeth in Glasgow, and also through respective portfolios. The expectation is that for non-residential and commercial buildings, including schools, and that would also include hotels, which are except to residential buildings, but residential buildings that are serviced or occupied by staff 24 hours a day. Again, the responsibility of the building owner to take those works forward. So this programme is dealing with exclusively with residential properties.
I accept that. However, there is a problem with these particular types of building, and my concern is that Scotland still hasn't extended the ban on cladding to include these buildings. So is that something that's actively being explored? And when will we see an answer on that? Because again, I've been trying for months now to get a direction from the government whether or not this extension or potential extension of the ban will include these types of buildings. And does the Cabinet Secretary agree that would therefore bring us into line with what's happening in the rest of the United Kingdom as well?
So firstly, I understand this is something that you're concerned with. We haven't actually had the opportunity, I don't think, to properly discuss it. So I would undertake today to do that with you. I know that there was attempts through the housing bill, and I considered your amendment there, and we weren't able to accept it for a number of reasons. So I would propose to discuss that with you offline, or indeed to speak to some of my colleagues across government who are dealing with the other types of buildings. One thing I will do that, and I will come back to you. In another part of my portfolio, and actually with official colleagues who are not here, in building standards, we are, for example, responding to the recommendations from the Cameron House inquiry, which obviously refers to hotels and fire safety. So there is a suite of work ongoing there, and I should like to update you on that and also come back to you on the question of cladding as well.
No, that's helpful, thank you. And then just finally on testing, because the BS 8414 testing system has been seen as a route to compliance when it comes to cladding. So I'm just wanting to find out what the government's position is on this particular testing model, given that the evidence from the Grenfell Tower inquiry was stark that this should not be used as the testing system.
As a technical question, Convener, I'm just going to pop over to my colleague who can hopefully attend to that.
Yeah, so it's been the position in Scotland that since 2005 that cladding systems should be non-combustible residential properties and or have independently passed a large-scale fire test. The ban on combustible cladding has then subsequently been extended through amendments post-Grenfell and in 2022, so that in principle no non-combustible cladding is extended to buildings of any height in Scotland, and it was the case following the building standards amendments that were made in 2005 that in principle combustible cladding of the types that was found on the Grenfell Tower would not have complied with building standards in Scotland since that time.
Helpful, thank you very much. And then finally, it's a question linked to cladding, but also brings in the proposed building safety levy. And I'm just looking to find out what the estimates of total Scottish Government funding would be required for evidence gathering, single building assessments, remediation work and future monitoring requirements and what role a potential levy would play in that, if any?
Yes, thank you. And it's a very pertinent question. I was referring earlier to the significant expansion in the programme that we're now both seeing and expecting to continue to see. So the total costs is something the government's turning its mind to, but doing so in a way that is fulsomely backing this with public money, because we want to see it done. I think the estimate that we currently have is about between 1.7 billion to 3.1 billion over 15 years. Stephen, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. 1.7 billion to 3.1 billion over 15 years is the estimate of the expenditure, and the building safety levy, currently being taken through Parliament by my colleague Ivan McKee, will make a contribution to that of around 30 million per annum from 2027. That's the expected provision.
And finally, on that point, you know, we've had Homes for Scotland, Scottish Property Federation, Scottish Land and Estates saying that they are not in agreement with the building safety levy. So how will you as Cabinet Secretary, you know, discuss and engage with people who are concerned to make sure that those concerns are certainly being voiced as part of this? Because £30 million seems quite small in the grand scale of what you're trying to achieve in order to make buildings safe.
Yeah, and look, I would probably start with the final point that you've made there, which is that when you consider the public purse may make between 1.7 and 3.1 billion pounds of a contribution to a very important matter, which we, you know, absolutely need to do and will do, 30 million per annum is a small contribution to that, and therefore I am very supportive of the building safety levy and it going ahead and it contributing to the overall costs. Now, that's not to say that I don't understand there are concerns, particularly from some smaller operators, and I have already discussed some of it in respect of small and medium-sized enterprises with Homes for Scotland. So I would be open-minded to ensuring proportionality in the way that the building safety levy operates, but it must operate because we need that contribution to what is a significant task with a large price tag.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. We're now going to go online, and I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor with a question. Technical pause. There you go.
Yep, sorry about that. I think I always do the same thing, Convener, and try and unmute myself while broadcasting is doing the same thing. So my apologies. Good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and your officials. It's really following on from Megan Gallagher's line of questioning there, and I know you have touched on it already, Cabinet Secretary. But I wonder if you can just state, I suppose, for the record, when you think the remediation of all other affected buildings in relation to that will be expected to be finished.
Yes, absolutely. So I would refer back to the new commitments that we made over the summer, which were that by 2029, every high-risk residential building over 18 metres in Scotland will have been resolved, whether made safe, decommissioned or replaced, and every building between 11 and 18 metres will be on a defined pathway to resolution, supported by robust assessment, planning and funding for essential cladding remediation. And I think it's worth noting that was a new goal made over the summer. It is ambitious, but it's right that we focus on getting this work done now that all the building blocks are in place. And Stephen will correct me if I'm wrong, but that brings us into line with England's timetable.
Yes, that is broadly in line with remediation timetables across the UK. Of course, the anticipation is that once high-risk, high-rise buildings are completed, not only do we have a remediation pathway for everything else, but that it is done as quickly as possible thereafter.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And one follow-up question, if I may, Convener. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that of the RAC issues that are present in North Lanarkshire Council area, the area where I represent. I'm not by any not saying by any means that it's the worst affected area, but there has been some high-profile situations relating to RAC. And what I wanted to know is there any direct support for councils like North Lanarkshire Council and other councils in terms of meeting deadlines and getting this work done?
Thank you for the question. So, I suppose we've been discussing cladding, and cladding is it's an issue which comes from a tragic event where dishonesty, etc., has been uncovered, and which, as we've just discussed with Megan Gallagher, is going to be a significant programme with a significant price tag. And over the summer, hopefully you will have seen the government putting more tens of millions more money behind resolving the cladding issue across Scotland. Now, compare that to RAC. RAC is it's a building standards issue. RAC is a product which, when maintained properly, can remain usable and safe, and it is still used in countries throughout the world. So it is in a different realm to the cladding question. And when it comes to spend on that, as the government fulsomely backs the remediation of cladding across Scotland, hopefully it's apparent that public money simply cannot stretch in that scale to other potential issues. So the position on funding in respect of RAC is that it is a homeowner's issue. It's essentially a matter of building maintenance, which is always, in principle, the homeowner. Now, in some cases, that will be an individual. In some cases, that will be a local authority or an RSL. And I have been clear that there will be no RAC pot of money from the Scottish Government. We simply do not have the flexibility to provide that. There is only one government across the United Kingdom who has the flexibility to respond to unforeseen expenditure like that, and that's the UK government. That's why I'm pressing them to create a national RAC fund, because it's present throughout the UK. These homes were sold under Right to Buy, which far predates the devolution era. So I'll continue to do that. In the meantime, what I have said is that I will consider applications for flexibility of existing funding that we make available to councils, and colleagues might have seen last week in respect of Aberdeen City Council that we were able to come to an agreement in respect to the delivery of affordable homes. So there will be no Scottish Government RAC fund, but I will work with homeowners, be that individuals or councils and RSLs, to provide support and best practice and share learning, and also to consider flexibility of existing funds. That was a rather long answer, I'm sorry.
My mind, so something that we've been exploring in the committee as a whole since, I think actually it first came up in a very early cladding session, was around the idea that so in RAC, if the responsibility is the homeowners, it's a homeowner's issue, and I think that was helpful, the differentiation there that you made. If it's a homeowner's responsibility, I can imagine that homeowners don't necessarily know what their homes are made of. And that's something that we've been discussing here is, do we need to get some kind of something set up where we actually know, not to kind of tiny details, but the general products that go into homes, so that when people buy a home, they know what they're buying. They know that there's RAC in it. They know that it's clad in some particular material. So that people really start to understand that you're not just buying a home, but you actually need to maintain and operate it in a particular way because there's these materials involved, which I think is a different way of looking at a home. I think many people are just used to buying a home and living in it. But I think we're moving into a new direction where we're exploring things like passive house and all that kind of stuff, where actually what's coming up is that we need to learn how to maintain and operate, not just clean the gutters, but understand in a bit more detail what we're living in. Well, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think so. And you know, it's something that's really, it's been on my mind, because as I state the principle that it's a homeowner's responsibility if RAC emerges, of course I'm considering what that actually means for the people involved. And You know, I sympathise with them hugely because it's a very difficult thing to be going through. One of the things I think we can do in exactly the train of thought that you've put to me, convener, is to work, for example, with the Institute of Structural Engineers on very clear and readily understandable guidance about what to do if you think your home might have RAC or other building maintenance issues. I recently created a RAC and Housing Leadership Group, which I chair, and I bring the leaders of councils together with RSL, the heads of the RSLs and others to share best practice on what each council is doing, etc. And one of the things I'm very keen to use that forum to do is to bring the Institute of Structural Engineers guidance for housing, which is nearing completion, making sure there's a really clear understanding about what that suggests in respect of RAC, make sure that councils are well equipped to inform householders on it, and then also bring people like UK Finance and the Institute of British Insurers, the Association of British Insurers, and ask questions like, now that we have this guidance, can we get to a position where we accept that if RAC is present but RAC has been remediated and it's now at green status, can that house be borrowed on? So I think there's a lot, digressed slightly, but your point about understanding your building is critical. The guidance from iStruct-E will help with that, and I also think it can help us to address issues of borrowing and mortgaging.
Okay, thanks very much. Fulton, I think you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, thanks, convener. It was just to clarify a point there and give my apologies to both yourself and the Cabinet Secretary for perhaps being opportune, given issues within my own area and constituency casework that I've had, and muddling up, if you like, for the want of a better word, cladding and RAC. So I know that I'll be in the Clerk's bad books for having started off another conversation on RAC, but I do think it was good to get some of that on the record. There probably isn't a better place to bring that supplementary question in, so I just want to apologise to yourself and also for not giving the Cabinet Secretary any advance notice that I was going to ask that question. But I do appreciate her answer, and I think it was very good to get some of that on the record. So that was all I wanted to say, convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fulton. Okay, so now we're kind of closing the door of cladding. I think that was very useful to get some of the processes you've been through and where you're at with that, and it was useful to get that bit of discussion on RAC. We're going to move into your broader portfolio priorities. So we've got a number of areas that we want to cover. We're going to talk about the Housing Emergency Action Plan and implementation, housing supply and investment, heat and buildings, dampness and mould regulations, and regulatory control. So that's what we're going to work through. So I'm going to start the conversation, and I'm going to focus on the Housing Emergency Action Plan. So I'd be interested to understand what difference having a Housing Emergency Action Plan is going to make in tackling the housing emergency, and how this represents a change of approach.
Thank you, convener. So I suppose it's maybe not the easiest question for me to reflect on, just simply because of when I came into post. But certainly in taking up the role in June, it was immediately apparent to me that I wanted to spend the summer speaking to as many stakeholders as I could, members, the housing sector, the charity sector, and asking the question the question that I often posed to them was, we have some of the most protective anti-homelessness laws of any country. We have, in difficult times, consistently invested in the delivery of affordable homes, with 140,000 now having been built. And for a long time, it felt that the system was in a state of equilibrium, and I was seeking their views on what has changed to lead us to a situation now where we have considerable strain and where demand is outstripping supply, and seeking their views on that. And then my objective was to turn that into a plan which could both respond now with actions in the immediate term to help release the pressure that exists within temporary accommodation, was never intended to operate to the scale that it is just now, but also set the groundwork for change over the long term. So my plan sought to do that, with the first part being ending children living in temporary accommodation, the second part being about supporting the housing needs now of vulnerable communities, and then that longer term piece of work about creating the conditions for investment and growth, which ultimately will be how we reset the housing system in Scotland to function as it was intended and as it ought to. So that's what my plan is trying to do. And I think that it will make a difference. I'm very confident of that. It has been, I wouldn't say this if it wasn't true, but it has been roundly welcomed by charity and by housing sector. But it's not the last word by any means, and it will continue to be a live document and a live approach to managing a complex task.
Okay, and because it's a live approach, a live document and approach, we'd be interested to get a sense of how you're intending to monitor implementation of that plan. It kind of seems to me like it's a bit of a two-pronged approach. You're tackling the initial pressures, but that long-term investment. So monitoring the implementation, the impact, and what indicators you're going to be using to assess whether the housing emergency is actually reducing.
So I might take those two questions separately, the monitoring and then the indicators. So having completed the plan, my attention is immediately focused to delivery of it and tracking the delivery of it. And being a plan that speaks to protection from domestic abuse through flipping and acquisitions of houses now through to building, planning, it requires me to work across government. So I have set up a group of officials who will report to me on a fortnightly basis. I'll have a written update on a weekly basis, a fortnightly meeting, where the representatives from the teams across government will report to me on how each of the 20 actions are being taken forward. That's just an internal good governance piece of work. I also have the Cabinet Subcommittee on Economy and Investment that the Deputy First Minister leads, and housing is a big part of that. So that's another way we manage internal delivery. Externally, I have the Housing to 2040 board, which we will meet shortly for the first time since the Housing Emergency Action Plan was published. And I've taken a bit of time to consider how we might pivot to having that board oversee the delivery of the plan, as well as our wider 2040 ambitions, none of which, incidentally, has been replaced by the plan. It's only added to. And then there's a really important piece of work with the folks that I am relying on delivering this, which, you know, chief amongst that is local authorities and registered social landlords. And early in post, I did a suite of meetings with the leaders of the 5 councils with the most strained homelessness situations, and I will now do another suite, and I'm very likely to put that on a quarterly basis, which will be about understanding the pressures that they face now, but also how they're implementing the plan to make it work. And I think just on the indicators point, we was very pleased to work with Mark Griffin on his amendment to the housing bill, which was all about housing emergency. How do you know when you're in it? How do you know when you're coming out of it? So we will now work to implement that provision. It just needs to be carefully done because, as we all know, you know, Argyll and Bute was the first area to declare it's going to look very different there coming out of a housing emergency to what it's going to look like in Glasgow. So it's about having indicators that are specific enough, but also broad enough to reflect different circumstances.
Just for clarity, you say you met with the 5 councils with the most strained homelessness situation. Could you say who they are? Because there were more than 5 that declared housing emergencies. It would just be good to see if we're on the same page.
Edinburgh City Council, Glasgow City Council, South Lanarkshire Council, West Lothian, and Fife. And if I'm wrong, I will absolutely correct that. But certainly the first 3 are absolutely right.
Okay, great. And then just so you mentioned that it's great that you're pulling in the 2040 board and various people to kind of support the process. There's a housing emergency delivery action and insurance group. Is that one of them that you mentioned? without a title, or is that something separate? And if it is separate, what's their role?
I'll probably come to Matt on this because that definitely predates my time, and I expect that's an official-led piece of work.
It is indeed. This is a group that was set up primarily to support officials across the Scottish Government on the housing emergency. It works across portfolios, so brings in officials from health, from justice, from education to sort of basically recognising that housing emergency is a problem that sits right across portfolios and isn't just a housing problem. That currently meets monthly and was chaired by the DG for Communities.
Back to indicators. So, Cabinet Secretary, I think maybe that's where you're thinking about the provision that Mark Griffin brought through in the housing bill. Is that where you're going to start to delve into what your indicators might be? Is that what you were saying?
That's right, Convener. Doing so sensitively, I think, I already monitor number of people in temporary accommodation, number of children in temporary accommodation, number of breaches of statutory obligations at local authority level, people indicating that they've slept rough in the months prior to presenting as homeless. So I already monitor all these things and have management information in respect of it. And I think that the task now is pulling that all together into reasonable ways of deciphering whether things are getting better or if they're getting worse, or when we might say that we're through it. But that will be very different between areas.
So just coming back to your point about relieving the pressure of these, particularly children in temporary accommodation, I think the committee would welcome updates on that to kind of move along with you on that journey and understand how that concern that we have around particularly young people, but people in general in temporary accommodation. I think it would be helpful to be kept abreast of that development.
Of course, and after today I will write to you, Convener, because in the most recent homelessness statistics from 2 or 3 weeks ago, they didn't make for easy reading whatsoever. But within that, there were some green shoots in that certain councils had managed to substantially reduce the number of children that were in temporary accommodation. To be honest, I wouldn't want to... Aberdeenshire, Aberdeen City, I think were some 45-50% reductions. But in order to be absolutely accurate, what I'll do is I'll come back to you in writing with that. However, clearly the situation in particular in Glasgow is very, very strained. And there are things that are adding to that, not least the UK government's approach to their asylum policy, which is causing difficulty and has to be handled exceptionally sensitively. But one of the main things that the Housing Emergency Action Plan does is double that fund for voids and acquisitions, which the committee will have been aware we've been doing for a year now. We've doubled it. And I think we demonstrated great progress. Councils demonstrated great progress in using that money to bring social voids back into use. That work has really gotten us to the point where there's very few social voids left to be turned over. I still want to see what's left turned over, but we now move to acquisitions as well, buying on the open market. And particularly, I have asked local authorities to use that money to buy family-sized homes, because they're harder to come by, but they're the ones that will get children out of temporary accommodation. And just to add to that, another part of the plan that I'm ambitious for is asking councils to implement the Alacho guidance on flipping, ultimately going out to households who are currently in suitable accommodation except for the fact that it's temporary, and discussing with them having it changed to be a permanent residence. Because that kind of thing could make a difference quite quickly, albeit we would have to backfill the supply of temporary accommodation, which the acquisitions fund could do.
Well, that sounds good. It sounds like a way to reduce the kind of unsettling nature of having to move on if you've been in a temporary place that could become kind of a permanent home. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on and we're going to open up the topic of housing supply and investment, and I'm going to bring in Evelyn Tweed with a number of questions.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and officials. Thanks for your answers so far. Recent statistics reveal that housing completions are down and new build starts are down from the previous year. Can the Cabinet Secretary just share what she feels is impacting the programme? What are we dealing with?
That's a really good question. In the last 3 weeks, I have had to present to the First Minister homelessness statistics that are going in the wrong direction, and more recently, house building statistics that I wasn't happy with. They both point, I think, to a, because I spoke earlier about how our legislation, Scotland's laws on anti-homelessness are so strong. We've just strengthened them further with the housing bill. Equally, we have consistently spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds every year to build affordable homes, and we've got a great record, but we've still got this strain. So your question is one I've asked myself over and over again. I think we're in a bit of a perfect storm recently, whereby economic conditions have been either stagnant or poor, where, for example, the cost of materials between 2020 and 2025 has risen by 40%. Any house builder facing that is immediately not able to deliver as they would want to. And other general economic headwinds have been difficult for the industry. They've been difficult for government. You know, our capital budgets have been under severe pressure as well. And then at the same time, I think those same difficult economic conditions have affected households to the point where people have precarity in the private rented sector, or whereas they might before have been able to manage their bills, the cost of energy skyrocketed and their rent suffers. So we've been in a bit of a perfect storm. But I think those, in terms of house building alone, those economic headwinds and particularly construction inflation has been a massive, massive issue in the last 5 years.
And obviously the government has a target of 110,000 new homes. How is that going to be achieved, given what you've just said?
Yeah, again, we're all turning our minds to this. I have essentially made changing the direction of the homelessness stats and the direction of the house building stats as my goal, or at least trying to set the groundwork for that to be able to happen. So the Housing Emergency Action Plan, I mentioned to the convener that the third part of that was about creating the optimum conditions for investment in our housing sector. So one of the things was about confidence. So over the summer it was put to me, one of the things that would be very helpful is if we had multi-annual certainty on funding. So we've delivered multi-annual certainty in funding, or I've committed to it. Shona Robeson will set it out in the spending review. More money always helps, and we have accompanied that multi-annual funding with an uptick in funding for affordable home supply programme, up to about 808 million this year, and then up to 4.9 billion over the coming 4 years. Another thing we have done is set an all-tenure target of increasing delivery of 10% each year in the next 3 years, which was another call from the sector to say that, you know, that leadership from government to say, we want you to go ahead and build. So that's there too. And then I think there's other facilitators like planning. So Ivan McKee has been doing a huge amount of work with the planning team to make sure that it is an enabler of development and not an inhibitor of it. I did pull out some information that I was going to use in respect to planning. Yes, so we've created a national planning hub, which has got the capacity to offer surge capacity to local authorities who are potentially under pressure. We've recruited 17 future planners to work part-time with the Scottish Government whilst they study. We've trebled the number of bursaries for student planners. And also there's a big bit of work ongoing just now on stalled sites. So I don't actually have the figure for how many stalled sites we have. No, I will make sure it's sent to the committee. But ultimately, these are areas where planning permission's been given, but the build hasn't taken place. So we are actively brokering those agreements now to say what's holding this up, how do we move forward to delivery. And we added to that in the plan with a new notification direction to local authorities. Essentially, we're going to oversee how MPF4 is being applied across local authorities, and other bits and pieces, including asking for proportionality when dealing with SMEs. So all of this package is about trying to create optimum conditions for investment and for delivery. And I should say the exemptions from rent control for mid-market rent and build to rent are also ways that we're trying to do exactly what you've asked. You know, how do you achieve this? Because we need to build capacity quite rapidly.
As somebody who used to work at a high level in housing associations, this is music to my ears, because you're coming at the issue from all angles. And one of the things when I worked in housing associations was that there were always obstacles, and it felt at times that the government was quite far away from the real nub of the problem. But it sounds like the government's getting really into it. It's getting into like planning issues, and hopefully that will unblock a lot of new development as well. So that's great to hear. My last question is about a recent report called Affordable Housing Need in Scotland Post 2026. And obviously it was looking at housing pressures, housing needs, and it particularly focused on the east of the country as having high housing need. And the questions around, is the government looking at all housing need proportionately? Do we have to look at things any differently?
Thank you. So the report, was this the one, SFHA, shelter?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, I suppose the key takeaway from that was the number of homes that I was taking from it was the number of homes that they were suggesting was required to be built. So very mindful of all of that. I think in respect of the east of the country, so first of all, we will respond to the report in full, and I welcome the report and everything that Shelter, CHI, SFHA are doing, working with us. My impression from having been in the portfolio for a few months is that the team operating the Affordable Home Supply Programme within government are extremely nimble. Now, you're maybe thinking back to your experience on the other side of the house, but what I see is a programme which is well funded, which is embedded in its areas. So we have area-based teams who know their part of Scotland extremely well and work really closely with whether it's the RSLs or the councils in the area, and who are flexible. So we will go to where, if a development looks as though it's nearing completion, we'll back it and back it. If it has to step back for whatever reasons, and you'll know there's a plethora of reasons why that could happen, we will be able to put the resource elsewhere and just ultimately be flexible to make sure we're getting homes delivered. But I don't know, Matt, whether you want to say more about the East or indeed how that programme can flex.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. So, as the Cabinet Secretary says, that programme is set up with a number of area teams who work very closely with RSLs and with local authorities. We have a lot of flex within that programme, which means that often we are moving around money from projects and programmes quite rapidly and quite quickly through the year. We are also increasingly trying to take a place-based approach to all of our policy making, so not just across the HSP, but across all the things that we're thinking across housing, building on what we've learned from the housing emergency and the approach that we took there to work very closely with particularly 5 local authorities most affected by housing difficulties.
And just to correct myself on my question, I think I mentioned Share, so I gave them a shout out for that report that I probably shouldn't have.
Thanks very much. Megan Gallagher.
If I may pick up on the line of questioning that Evelyn Tweed started on in relation to the affordable homes target, because again we have seen in previous years that there's been a reduction and then that was reinstated, but it was at a real terms loss still. So I'm looking for reassurance from the Cabinet Secretary that that won't happen in future years, to give certainty to the market, particularly when you're trying to achieve targets of affordable house building.
So yes, that's the idea of the plan. So we have, as I said, £808 million in the programme this year, and I've committed to up to 4.9 billion over the next 4 years, and that's exactly to give that certainty. And it is worth, Megan Gallagher puts on the record that in 1 year the programme, the funding of the programme took a step backwards. But that was a response to extremely difficult budgetary decisions within government, and is an otherwise very, very small interruption to what is otherwise 18 years of consistent investment in affordable homes and delivery of same.
No, I understand. Again, it's the certainty of funding, and I think that's something that you have discussed in terms of multi-year funding. Yeah. But what I would say on the record as well, that it has taken 18 years for the government to elevate housing to a Cabinet Secretary post. We have got there, and I'm pleased that we've got there, but it should not have taken that long to do so. And on the 4.9 billion that you've mentioned there over the next 4 years, that again referring to the report by CIA, Shelter Scotland, SFHA, they're saying that around you'll need to double that. I think it's 8.2 billion that you'll need, as opposed to 4.9 to tackle what they say is needed to tackle the housing emergency overall in relation to housing investment, but also the number of homes that will need to be built. So is the Cabinet Secretary going to review the target of 110,000 affordable homes to the 15,000 homes that will be needed every single year? Is that something that she's actively looking into? And perhaps what her response is to the doubling of the investment that other housing spokespeople in terms of housing spokespeople in terms of organisations, charitable organisations have called for?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, I'm not reviewing the 110,000 target. 110,000 by 2032. Of course, that's having right now delivered 140,000. So, there's a lot being done before we reset our target, and I'm not going to review that. I absolutely welcome the research by the three groups that have been mentioned. I have the greatest of respect for them and the work they do and the work that they're supporting us to do. And in principle, I completely agree with them that the number of affordable homes delivered each year must now increase to meet the significant demand in the system. But we firstly don't have capacity to deliver 15,000 homes a year just now. What I'm trying to do is preemptively do the work now so that we can build to that kind of annual delivery towards the end of the target, because we've got to 2032 in order to meet this. And the other thing is, the government, our capital budget over the spending review period is expected to fall by 1.1% in real terms. So within that, we have, and prices are ever increasing, as we've discussed. So within that, as a government, we've got very difficult decisions to make about the prioritisation of capital funding. And I have just argued and had agreed that we'll spend 4.9 billion over the next 4 years on housing, which is a significant win in very, very difficult economic circumstances. 8.2 billion is unrealistic at this stage, when we also have bridges to build, roads to fix, schools to build, prisons to build. It's difficult decisions to be made. However, housing's already been prioritised within that.
No, I understand where the Cabinet Secretary is coming from. If I can quote the National Director of CIH Scotland, who said that the 4.9 billion is a welcome demonstration of intent, but it fails to meet Scotland's social and affordable housing need and resolve the housing emergency. Without investing further, is there a real risk that we're not going to be able to tackle the housing emergency? And is that still the top priority of government?
So I will continue and will always argue for the greatest possible investment in housing. That's my job in government, and actually we have succeeded in that because, as I say, in very difficult economic circumstances, when the Finance Secretary is looking at a very strained budget, we've been able to argue and have agreed to this significant uplift over the next 4 years. And just to put it into a little bit of context, I think we'll spend 3.5 billion over this 5-year term. And this is 4.9 over the next 4-year term. So less time, more money. It is a significant uplift. But the private sector will have to play an important part in this as well. And that's why I have very confidently said that alongside affordable homes investment must be the right circumstances for private investment, not least in the work we did to make institutional exemptions from rent control. That's all about trying to say the government will do as much as we can to support affordable homes, and we will also try and make the circumstances right for the rest of the sector, because we do need more investment, we do need all tenure delivery, and only through the combination of all of that will we get to where we need to be in the coming years.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to bring in Mark Griffin with a question.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Morning.
I just wanted to come back to the 110,000 affordable homes target by 2032. Now, up to June this year, there have been almost 30,000 homes built. The government's plan for the next 4 years is 39,000. By my math, that leaves ballpark 40,000 homes, affordable homes, to be built in the last 2 years to hit that target. So, how is the government planning on ramping up supply from, circa 40,000 homes over 4 years to 40,000 homes in the last 2 years?
So I haven't been able to exactly follow your figures as you were saying that, so I'm not able to say whether they're exactly the ones I'm working with or not, but no doubt you've done the math correctly. Everything that we are doing just now is about trying to go from where we are with significant headwinds, not least inflation, to where we need to be at 110,000 by 2032. And I'm afraid it's everything that I've already been saying. It's about the increase in the affordable supply programme. It's about giving 4 years of certainty that that's coming to allow RSLs and councils and others to plan. It's about setting the all tenure target. It's about making sure planning is a facilitator and not an inhibitor. It is all of these things, trying to build the capacity up to where we need to be, because it is a steep curve.
Okay. And on the government commitment of that £4.9 billion, I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary is able to set out the detail of how that £4.9 billion will be spent, whether that is grant and capital, whether that's partially leveraged from the private sector, whether that's in the form of loans. I just wonder if there's any detail that you can give us to expand on that and put into pictures what that £4.9 billion actually is and how it will be spent.
So I completely understand the desire to have that, but I can't preempt the spending review in the budget, which Shona Robeson is working on just now, and which will set out all of the detail of that. But what I can say is that it will be a combination of public investment with privately leveraged private investment, which is absolutely incumbent on me to work to try and deliver, because of the chronic shortage of public funding that we're experiencing across the UK just now. So, but up to £4.9 billion will be spent. It will be a combination of public and leveraged private investment. And the other bit of detail I would just confirm is that it will retain the 70% social target and the 10% rural and islands target. Okay,
thank you. And finally, Convener, on the new all tenure delivery ambitions to increase by 10% a year, that's a really welcome change in government policy. I think something that the sector and parties have been calling for too. Is really important to get an all tenure target, as well as that really crucial affordable homes target. So I really welcome that. I just wonder how the government will facilitate hitting that 10% target, but also just for our understanding what, a 10% increase is obviously a relative target. What's the baseline that you're measuring that 10% increase on?
So as part of my discussions over the summer, as well as the multi-annual funding and the increase in funding, the all tenure target was probably the third most frequently put to me as what would make a difference. So I'm glad to have been able to commit to that, and I think it will drive development. Now, there was a question of whether we went for a target that was X number of houses or whether it was a percentage, and I decided to go for a percentage and one that climbs, in order to reflect, I think, some of the discussion we've been having today, which is about we need to build capacity. So it felt to me like a more realistic approach to take the 10% each year over 3 years rather than an overall figure. Matt, I don't know if there's more you might want to say about that, about the baseline and where we start today.
Sorry, I can't.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't. Sorry.
Oh. We'll come back to you on that one then. I mean, I don't actually have the figures for the all tenure delivery this year. They were just released last week, and ultimately we'll be baselining it from that and moving forward from it, i.e. where we are now, 10% each year over the next 3 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. It was good to hear you say that you've got your eye on the 10% rural and island housing, and I just wanted to ask around your thoughts around the Rural and Island Housing Fund and whether that's going to move into a multi-year pot and you know, other aspects of that, like there are situations where housing is built that is future proofing, right? So there's different approaches to how that fund is used, but I've encountered communities that are building housing that is high quality, future proofed, and helps us draw down on our carbon emissions, whereas other housing is not going as far as that. And my sense is that maybe we need to be looking at reviewing it again. I know it was reviewed recently, but reviewing it again and looking at could more money be put towards those projects, those designs that are supporting our carbon emissions reduction, and also things like there are situations in rural communities where they'll be given the funding, but they don't actually have they don't have a wind turbine or something that's generating the income to keep a project officer on. So they've got the money for the housing, but actually not the money to keep that project officer from 1 year to another. So while we desperately need that pipeline of housing in rural and island communities, and we are giving money through the fund, we're not necessarily making sure that it's easy, right? That's a block in a way that we need to be addressing. So I just wonder if you've got your eye on that, given you do have your eye on that 10% delivery of, and I would say it's at least 10%.
It is at least 10%, and we've exceeded it. I mean, I don't think we've got, have you got the figure for, maybe if you could have a look for me, Matt, because we have exceeded the delivery on that, and I'm very pleased to see it, and I want to see that continue. So first of all, I always encourage every community group in my constituency to try and get a stake in a turbine, because it provides that ongoing revenue for them and that stability. And actually, we should be moving towards much greater community ownership of energy assets. I will always be open to ideas as to how the Rural and Islands Fund and the Key Workers Fund, how they're working, how they might be improved. So I would welcome the committee's views on that if that's something that you would want to put to me. I'm hugely enthusiastic about community developments, mindful, however, that I don't want to put onto community groups what ultimately should be being organised and delivered by government, national and local, and other housing actors in the area. So yes, I want to make sure the funds work to best effect. I don't want to overburden communities with the responsibility that really ought to be their government's responsibility.
Well, I think it's great to hear that that's your perspective. However, a lot of, certainly in my region, a lot of the housing is being delivered by communities because there's that gap. So maybe there's work to do to fill that gap. And there are situations where community-led housing has been done with fantastic partnerships, or partnerships with housing associations or registered social landlords and that kind of thing. So community might take forward the development, but then an RSL takes a couple of the properties to house people. So there is something there where we need to look at, well, why is it that it is ending up being communities that have to lead it? But on the other hand, it's good because they're actually getting the housing that they really need. So I would welcome you looking into that more. And yes, seeing how we can get to a point where local and national governments facilitating that better. Because I go to plenty of meetings where I hear about the many, many, many years a volunteer board is having to work through to deliver maybe two houses, but they're the houses that are crucial and transform that community and move it from being a community that's going to become quote, a bedroom community rather than a thriving, full-featured community with kids in the school and that kind of thing.
No, it can absolutely make a huge difference. One of the things that's been put to me is I wonder if it's about the identification of need, whether that needs to be more place-based and specific, because in your region, and actually even in somewhere like Clydesdale, the assessment for the whole area could be very different to, one small town or village within it. So I've got my eye on that.
Yeah, and so that whole need is, we have had people giving evidence around that and looking at a more nuanced approach on need, and the issue that people don't think there's a list because they don't see social housing in their community. They don't think to come and say we need it. So we're missing that as a gap there. I'm going to move on and onto heat and buildings. So I've got a few practical things I'd be interested to hear about, and then I'll bring in a couple of colleagues with questions. So timings on the anticipated heat and buildings programme of work, so including the EPC regulations, the regulations requiring private landlords to meet defined energy evidence efficiency standards, the social housing net zero standard, and the heat and buildings bill, which we are looking forward to with anticipation.
Me too. So I'll try and work through them, convener, and I will bring in my colleague Jess as well to speak to some of that. I suppose just in general, we've had a lot of discussion about the delivery of homes, social homes, and in the wider sector, and the reality that none of us can escape, that it has to ramp up considerably. So we've discussed planning's role in that, about facilitating and not hindering, and the regulatory environment is another area that I have to be very watchful of to make sure that it is facilitating and not hindering. Now, to a large extent, much of the regulatory landscape is just non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned. Safety, fire, accessibility, all of these things. And I am also deeply personally committed to net zero. I think in that space, what I need to make sure is that they are sequenced in a way which is deliverable, reasonable, not going to impede delivery of homes, but is going to make sure that people live in good homes when they are delivered. So that's where I am. And having come into the post in June, and in all those parts of work that you mentioned, EPC reform, PRSMEs, social net zero standard, ultimately I'm just taking a moment to look across the board and make sure that they're sequenced properly and that they are going to be deliverable and not be a drag on delivery. So Jess will help me out with this, but I'll try and speak to them all. The EPC reform, I think, is a hugely important piece of work. Really, I mean, you will all have been involved with it and know a huge amount about it. It's the foundation from which we deliver the minimum energy efficiency. It will inform the bill. So we're going to lay the regulations for that very shortly. And I suspect we will be back with you, convener, and the committee quite soon, talking about EPC reform. The private rented sector minimum energy efficiency standards is very much caught up with the bill. The bill I am hoping to introduce soon. We are having to take some time to make sure that all aspects of what is a really complicated piece of legislation are lined up well so that I can present to Parliament something which you will be able to, I hope, support. One of the things that's a bit of an issue there is the UK's Warm Homes Plan. We have some idea of what's going to be in it, but frankly, not enough. And I have asked, and my officials have asked, and we have a very good relationship with the UK government, but we still don't know what's in it. And one of the really important things in terms of impacting on the bill is the work the UK need to do to balance the cost of gas relative to electricity, because that will impact the fuel poverty implications of the legislation. So whilst I'm very, very keen to get all that done and get it presented to Parliament, I have a UK Warms Home Plan, the detail of which I'm not availed of, but which could have a big impact on it. So I'm just trying to balance all that. Jess, I've probably missed... Oh, I think I missed the social net zero.
Efficiency standard, yeah.
That's paused just now, convener. Again, I just want to make sure that for parity across the sector, we're moving these products forward at the same time. So I appreciate that's not very helpful, but it's basically we're doing the work. Jess, is there anything to add to that?
No, I think just to reflect exactly what the Cabinet Secretary said, that we feel we have an absolute responsibility to align all of these things. And of course, the committee will also know that government will shortly bring forward the climate change plan. So making sure that all of this work is aligned and brought forward in a package that is kind of deliverable and makes sense. And also, obviously, Cabinet Secretary's reflected the other budgetary pressures, so making sure that with all of these pieces of work, we have a clear plan for how we would then deliver and give certainty to the sector that we know is needed. Just on PRSME specifically, the consultation on that one closed just recently, so we're reflecting on the responses from that before we give further advice to the Cabinet Secretary in line with her steer on taking an overview of regulation to make sure that it's appropriate in the context of the other housing supply challenges.
Okay, thanks. Just on the conversations you're having with the UK government and their Warm Homes plan and that lack of clarity, and you talked about how there's this kind of unknown around the electricity gas link there. And clearly, if those were delinked, if we had electricity delinked from international gas prices, that would transform radically our fuel poverty situation. Have you had any conversations or colleagues in the government, discussions with the UK government around that direction of travel?
Yes, we have, Convener, because it's such a pivotal point. Officials, I think it would be fair to say you have a very good cross-government relationship with the officials in the UK government. Likewise, I had a good relationship with Minister Finbula and had good discussions with her about her Warm Homes plan, what Scottish Government were trying to do, and how that issue of the cost of electricity and gas was pivotal to it all. She has now moved, but I have since met with Minister McCluskey, the new UK Minister responsible, and I put the case to him as well, although he was, to be fair, 2 or 3 days into the job. And having, I think, to look at everything that had been prepared in respect to the Warm Homes plan and make sure that for his part he was comfortable with it. So there has been a delay as a result of the reshuffle from the Deputy Prime Minister's exit from government, but we are continuing to push for detail on the plan and for the UK's intentions in respect of the costs of gas and electricity.
Okay. Great, well that's helpful, and from my experience it's good to get in early when somebody gets a new post with the priority thing and get it lodged in their mind. I'm going to bring in a couple of colleagues with questions, supplementary questions, so I'm going to start with Megan Gallagher and then I'm going to go online to Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I'm going to probe you a little bit further on the timings of this bill, because the consultation began on the 28th of November 2023, and I do believe the Scottish Government started talking about this in 2021. So that's a substantial amount of time. We're now hearing this morning that there is the Warmer Homes plan. We're hearing that nothing's going to be brought forward until the Climate Action Plan has been completed. But you've had all this time to bring something forward. So my question is, we've got 5 and a bit months left. Is that sufficient time for a committee to scrutinise, for amendments to be considered, and then for the bill to be brought to the Chamber for Stage 3 proceedings before Parliament closes for the election?
Thank you. So it is a substantial amount of time. It's a hugely substantial piece of legislation, and I know you will all appreciate that. The Heat and Buildings Bill, I have said previously, I think will be one of the biggest and most important pieces of legislation in devolution, because it could, depending on its content, legislate right into the heart of people's homes for how they heat their homes. So I appreciate it's been a long time, but at the same time, I can't apologise for the government taking the time to get this right for people in Scotland. And the other reason for delay is just how closely linked we are to policy in UK. And I mentioned the Warm Homes Plan. So I could introduce a Heat and Buildings Bill and then have the content of the Warm Homes Plan render some of it inoperable or, not ideal. And as I was saying to the convener, the question of the cost of gas and electricity will make a massive difference in terms of the fuel poverty aspects of all of this. So forgive me, as leading the bill, I'm determined to make sure that we go into it with the greatest possible understanding of what's going to happen in the rest of the UK and what the impact is going to be for the people of Scotland. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, but I understand it has been a long process. Equally, I completely understand the concern for the rest of the time that remains in Parliament for scrutiny, but I still intend to introduce a bill, and I still intend that it will be finished by the time Parliament falls.
So that's a cast iron guarantee that the bill will come before the end of Parliament?
It's still my intention to do so.
Okay. And on the issue of what we're hearing in terms of it being delayed for reasons, the Warmer Homes scheme, you know, that was 2024. I've just looked up there. So you've had time before that to bring something concrete to the table. I understand that you know, you're still relatively new in post, but your predecessors, you know, have had time, sufficient amount of time, to bring something concrete to the table. Now, I know, of course, there has been issues, given that you were in coalition, now not in coalition. However, it's uncertainty for the sector, and I don't think that's fair. Do you think that is a fair assessment, that you've got to make sure that the sector is coming along with you on this journey, and this uncertainty as to whether a bill will come or not is not very helpful for them?
So, first of all, I think the Warmer Homes scheme is a Scottish Government scheme. That's separate from the Warm Homes Plan, which is no, that's okay. The Warm Homes Plan has not been introduced yet. It's due to be introduced, and I just don't know what the UK Government are going to introduce with it, which is unsatisfactory, but that's the way it is. I will keep pressing for detail. I understand that we want to give certainty to the sector because you know, there's huge opportunity, for example, in heat networks, and I want to see that opportunity realised. At the same time, this is a highly complex piece of legislation, which it's incumbent on me and my officials to make sure we get right, and it is not aided by the fact that we don't know what Scotland's other government are intending to do in respect of warm homes. So I'm continuing to press for more detail on that. I continue to try and refine the bill, and it remains my intention today to introduce a bill and to have it passed.
What if that plan doesn't come from the UK Government? What happens then?
So there is a tipping point after which the Scottish Government might have to move ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. Just on the Warm Homes Plan, it would be helpful for us to know, given we're going to be doing some scrutiny on the climate change plan, how that UK Warm Homes Plan would impact, from your view, the climate change plan.
I'm very sorry, Convener. I caught the last of your question there. How the Warm Homes Plan would affect the climate change
plan. Yeah. That we're...
Yes, so it is also tied up. In the same way that it will affect the bill, or could affect the bill, it also affects what we're doing, or what Ms Martin will take forward in the climate change plan.
Thanks. And I just wanted to, so you talked about the opportunity with heat networks, and in a previous answer to a question, you talked about how you see the importance of community ownership of renewable energy. And I know there's quite a strong idea around communities owning heat networks. So I just wonder if that's something that you're considering taking into consideration as you think about this bill, and maybe it's not part of this bill, but that opportunity for communities to actually have community ownership of heat networks seems to be, again, another way to build that community wealth.
Yes, in principle, I am absolutely in favour of this. I represent a part of Lanarkshire, which has many a former coal mining town, and I see firsthand how transferring from that and some of the economic dislocation that came from that closing into renewable energy and the money that can see flow into communities, it's transformational, and even more so where there's an ownership stake. So I am absolutely in favour of that, and I would want to see that be considered in heat networks as it is in onshore wind and in other types of renewable energy development.
Okay, thanks very much. So that's heat and buildings. Thanks for your answers on that. We're going to move on to a few questions which I'm just going to run through. The first few questions are on dampness and mould regulations and other regulations coming out of the Housing Scotland Bill. So I'd be interested to get a sense from you on the anticipated timings for the regulations that will come to us to implement AWAB's law for rented housing.
Yes, very happy to, Convener. So there's quite a bit of secondary legislation emerging from the Housing Bill. You will all be delighted to know, I'm sure, or look forward to discussing that with us. Awab's law and the implementation of that is one of the key ones. I was very keen when we were finalising stage 3 to make the commitment that it would be in force from March next year, and therefore the intention is to lay regulations very early in the new year, and we've already started to do the work to develop what will be in those regulations, because there's some, as you can imagine, we need to make sure that the differences between the social sector and the private rented sector are taken into account, as well as what's realistic for landlords and protective for tenants. And of course, it's helpful that we have similar work ongoing across the rest of the UK, which I'm keeping a very close eye on.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned that there's quite a lot of other bits of secondary legislation coming out of the housing bill. It would be very helpful for us to understand what you know now, what might be coming forward at what time.
Sure. Okay. So Awab's law, we've discussed. We will also bring forward regulations to implement the housing aspects of the Domestic Abuse Act. A significant priority for me, and if my memory serves me correct, in the Chamber I committed to doing that around Christmas time. So that'll be in advance of the Awab's law work. And the other major piece of secondary legislative work we will need to do is on the exemptions from rent control. Quite complex work there to not least define what, for example, build to rent is in law. Again, that work is underway. I think, Matt, that might be would that be the third of the three, do you think?
Those are the three, I think, high priority bits of secondary legislation. There's also just a commencement of a number of regs that came through in the housing bill. We're working on a plan for when we can do some of those things, which will be relatively straightforward, but we will be able to do some of those things before the end of this Parliament as well. Just on Awab's law, just to be clear, that will be subject to the affirmative procedure, so there will be time for Parliament to scrutinise those regs as well.
Okay. Just a final question on regulatory controls. So I'd be interested to get an update on progress on the assessment of the regulatory controls in relation to housing. So this year's programme for government includes a commitment to publish an action and implementation plan based on an assessment of the regulatory controls which exist in key growth sectors, starting with housing, public infrastructure and green industries by the end of 2025, designed to make it easier to do business. So you've been talking a bit about that, trying to make it easier to do business, but yeah, have you got any updates on that?
I think what I might do, Convener, is get you a written update on that. So the PFG commitment will be on track to deliver against it, and yes, a lot of what I've been doing has been about reviewing the regulatory landscape as it is. I think that was a economy-led piece of work, wasn't it? Yes. So the Cabinet Subcommittee on Economy and Investment is this sort of main interface between the Deputy First Minister and I. Housing has been a key part of that, and we have discussed some of that regulatory work around it. So I'll be very happy to update you on the delivery of that piece of work in the PFG. Another thing that would be worth letting the committee know is that Jess mentioned and I mentioned doing that work on net zero and energy efficiency regulations. I've asked the government's regulatory review group to assist me in that and basically to present to me what a reasonable sequencing would be. So again, that will be part of the work on the PFG agreement, and I will be glad to update you in writing. I'm sorry I don't have more information on it today.
That's fine. I've actually got another question that's kind of popped up when you said net zero. And when we had the housing minister in post, there's quite a lot of work being done around the fact that we've got a massive rollout of renewable energy in the Highlands and Islands region, and a lot of worker camps and housing that's going to need to be put in place in order to unlock that economic potential. And some of the discussion was around, is there an opportunity there to have that housing become legacy and actually become housing for rural and island communities? And I just wonder if that's something that you have picked up and have had conversations with the renewable sector around that.
So yes, I would say, however, that the the conversations that I've been having, excuse me, are more in the space of trying to get more houses rather than the question of legacy. Although I think it's an excellent idea, and I think we would want to manage it so that they could be once the need for the energy workers to be there had passed, if it passes. But I'm sort of at the front end of that work more so. Asking how do we make sure the homes get built to facilitate the economic opportunity. And again, in the Housing Emergency Action Plan, I was very keen that there was a specific rural aspect to it, because not only is there a shortage, but there's also enormous economic opportunities, not least in the energy revolution. And I want to make sure that we can have the houses to facilitate that. And one of the things that committee might be interested in is the commitment to work with SNIB and public bodies to understand the public land across the board and the extent to which that could better serve housing need. And I met with the Scottish Land Commission on that question because it flows from research that they did, I think, with the University of Glasgow. So Mary Goujon and I are essentially trying to take that forward.
That's great to hear that you are doing that, because that was some of the amendments I was bringing in stage 2 around unlocking land for housing. So it's good that you've picked that up. That concludes, you'll be maybe happy to know, our questions for this morning. And it's very good to have had you come and talk to the committee about your portfolio and get a bit more of the detail of where you're going with it, and also more detail on the cladding work that you're doing. So many thanks for joining us this morning. And as we previously agreed to take the next items in private, I now conclude the public part of the meeting and we will move into private. Thank you.